Here's a quick visual overview of what we're doing today so you can easily find any areas where you want more detail or a reminder of the whole process without having to dig through the video. This video is very much for beginning upcyclers, but it does assume that you know how to thread up a machine already and have access to a sewing machine. If you do, then we're ready to teach you a bunch of skills through this project that you can apply to literally millions of other situations. We're all about sustainable fashion here and helping you kick the fast fashion habit. So once you know how to sew this dress, you're going to have mastered a bunch of skills that you can apply to literally millions of other projects. So like the double fold hem, putting in a new sleeve, sewing on heavy lycra, piecing fabric together so it's big enough to do your patterns, and even drafting your own patterns. Those are all going to be within your skill set when you finish this dress. The dress we're sewing today was the winner of our last sketch contest, and it embodies several sustainable fashion design principles. To win, it had to be good at minimal waste, versatility, fairly easy to sew, and original. And while this dress is super fun, I just want to point out that you could easily make just the top part if you're more of a separates person. I suggest tackling one section at a go in this video and working through it while it's fresh in your mind. A good way to divide it up is to dye your fabric on the first day, make your pattern pieces on the second day, sew together the bodice on the third day, and put the sleeves in on the fourth day, and then immediate gratification, put that skirt on and boom, you're done on the fifth day. So that's my suggestion. One more thing, just to make this as helpful as possible for you, I'm going to be doing a live Q&A about this pattern, so anything that trips you up here I can address. And I'll have that overhead camera at my cutting table and the camera at my sewing machine, so I'll be able to show you everything in detail. You'll get a chance to see me making this top in my size because I really want one. I will link it in the description below along with the times for all the steps. You're going to need some thick yoga pants, 1 or 2 pairs should do ya, and a full gathered skirt. Before you rush out to the closest thrift store, you might try these places where you can find clothes for free. Here's what I started with. You're also going to need some basic sewing supplies and one specialty item, a ballpoint needle. You don't have to have it, but it's very helpful. Let's get started. It was obvious to me the first thing I need to do is dye the skirt. I'm not going in depth with the dyeing because Rit actually has a great video and I'm just going to put a link for that in the description below. Instead of using Procyan dye, which is my go-to because it's a low impact dye and it doesn't need heat to use it, so I can just go outside in the grass and do my dyeing there instead of spending an hour and a half setting up tarps in the kitchen. But with black, I have had difficulty getting my dye to mix, and so I've had grainy problems and color issues with the Procyan dye. So I wanted to try a new approach by using the black dye from Rit, which is in liquid form, and see how that goes. And I think the dye worked out great. You can see just a little bit of the original image, which is very much like the sketch. To begin, you're going to want to put down a piece of cardboard, something that you can easily push pins into, and a piece of paper. I like to use grocery store bags cut in half because they already have lines that I can use to line things up with. Here I'm lining up the top of the sleeve. Now, this particular garment that I'm taking the pattern off of, the sleeves have a weird little top, so it looks like that's not the top, but it really is the top. And I'm going to pin down at the top corner and the end of the sleeve and in the armpit. And then I'm just going to I'm going to make sure that the shirt side is really, really flat. And I'm going to go through, get back down there, darn you. I'm going to go around with a little push pin. You could do this with a needle, but it's going to be easier with push pins. And I'm basically making a little perforated dotted line that I can follow on the paper that I'll be using to draft this armhole shape. Okay, so we're going to get all the way to the top and then we're going to flip this puppy over. Come on. That's just so I know where it lines up. I'm going to leave the other pin in too, so I've got my lining up points. Yeah, it's got like a little leaf pattern in the top of this particular sleeve. This can be pretty approximate. In this case, I'm actually using a woven fabric. I'd recommend using a garment that just is about as stretchy as the leggings that you're going to be working from. So then if they have a similar, what we call recovery from being stretched, then the size will be approximately right. So now what I have here is, if you can see, there's a very faint little line of little holes on the right, and I am flattening the sleeve out now so I can find that end point, and I can take the angle, the direction that that line that creates the sleeve is going. And then I forgot to do that on the first side, so we're just going to backtrack a little bit here. It's okay if you don't do things in a perfect order. Now we're flattening out the right side of this sleeve, finding my end mark for the direction and my end mark for the armpit hole. I'm going to grab a heavy felt tip pen so that you guys can really see what this line looks like. I'm just connecting the dots. And I'm going to tell you, I get a little confused sometimes. This is the one that I'm going to, and then this is basically the underarm of the sleeve. So now I'm going down to the right, and yes, making the same mistake. No, that's the end of the sleeve, Stacy. Come on back. Whoa, there you go. You can do it. Off to the armpit. There we go. And that's the direction of the sleeve. I want to mark that top part of the sleeve for reference. Okay, and at this point, we are just drafting the pattern, so we're not adding seam allowance. We're going to go ahead and cut it out. I told you I do everything in real time, and now I'm kind of regretting it. There's going to be some times, I think, where just to be respectful of your time, I'm going to have to go fast. Now I'm going to fold it over, and we're not refining anything yet, because what we're going to do is we are going to spread out the sleeve. Here I am going to eve up the bottom just so it's easy to cut to a specific place. But we're going to open up this sleeve in a few different places so we can spread it out and add fabric to the top of it. To get the gathers, we're going to need more fabric. So I like to have sort of straight lines to go from, so I'm just going to, and again, I'm not being too precise here, I'm just going to draw a few lines where I think is a good place to split. I definitely want most of my gathers to be at the very top of the sleeve and not down the side of it and into the armhole. So I'm putting these about, I don't know, a third of the way, a quarter of the way down that side. And now we're going to cut these. I'm just drawing them in with markers so that you can really see them. And we'll cut those areas apart too, so that we can spread everything out. Now we're going to need another sheet of paper, and I'm choosing some packing paper. So I'm going to trace this part exactly up until that little slash that I made. This part, I'm not going to want any gathers in, right? And that's going to be the same on both sides. Now what I'm doing here is I'm marking 2 fingers up at the top, and I'm just going to eyeball it and draw kind of up to there. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to mark that whole seam line exactly, and then 2 fingers up and eyeball it. Now I'm going to bring my sleeve down so that I can get the distance between those underarm sleeves that I had before. And I'm drawing a new line because now it's spread apart. I'm drawing a new line to represent the under sleeve part. So now we have the shape of a puffy sleeve. How fun is that? And just eyeballing, there's a little bit of a curve to the way that that goes around. And again, this is not going to be important. We as upcyclers are going to make use of the existing hem from the leggings. Next thing we're going to want to do is add some seam allowance. So we don't do that when we're changing our pattern, but once we get done, we need to leave room for the seams to come together. And I like to use my finger as a guide. I know it's about 1/2 inch, which is where I tend to sew things. Actually, my finger's a little over 1/2 inch, and I like to err on the side of having just a little extra room, right? So I sew at 1/2 inch and use my finger as a guide. And again, this is very approximate at this point. With a knit and with gathered sleeves, this is somewhere where precision is not going to be super important, and we're still going to have pretty good results. Where this sleeve actually ends up is going to be very much determined by how much fabric we have left after we've cut the other parts that we need. Okay, let's cut this pattern out. Just a quick tip for cutting patterns is if you take all the big sections of paper off, it's a lot easier to work with. So that's a good first step to cutting things out quickly. Is it the lowest waste option? No, but let's be real. At this point, this paper is headed to the recycle bin. Snip, 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 snip. Snip, 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 snip. Now I'm comparing the length of the sleeve. So one part where we are going to want to have pretty good precision is in this underarm seam. And we're going to want those two sides to match each other exactly. And I'm going to just trim off the bottom ends here so we can see if we're doing that. So we've got the bottom part, the cuff part, all evened up. And after we cut out the top of our sleeve, we can have a look at how the armpit end is lining up. Snip, 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 snip. Snip, snip. Yes, I like my sound effects. Snip, snip. Looks like it's just a little bit longer on this one side, so I'm just going to mark that. I'm really not as worried about the big sections with the gathers. Now I'm salvaging the markings that I forgot to transfer of where the gathers start. So this is something that you're going to need to know on your pattern, and when you transfer your pattern to your fabric, you're also going to need that. Now I'm trimming off that little extra part so that those underarm seam lines are the same length now. And yep, just transferring my pattern markings. There you go. You now have your sleeve. Let's trace the bodice. We're going to use a similar technique. This piece of packing paper has a fold down the middle, and I'm just going to fold my shirt in half, so I only have to do this once, basically. What's most important to capture here is that underarm sleeve, but I'm also going to get an idea where the neckline was on the t-shirt, which will help me decide where I want to put the neckline on the new shirt. So again, pinning at the top and bottom, and this time I'm really not worrying if the sleeve has a little bit of rumples in it, but I'm very concerned with whether or not the bodice is super flat, and I'm hitting that same seam line at the top that I hit before. One thing that's nice is we can actually just trace the outside edges. We don't have to do the little poke pin thing. The poke pin thing is great for the neckline. So we've got the back neckline height, and now we're getting the front neckline height, just going through with our little dotted line. And that way we haven't really damaged our original garment, and I'm drawing in all the lines so it's easy to see. Mia says she is a size medium. So I am taking this from a standard measurement chart and putting a waistline onto the shirt. So this is how far down the bodice part of the dress is going to go, is to the waistline. And now I'm adding my seam allowance. Yeah, and sometimes I'm eyeballing it. I've got my finger there for reference where I can see it, but it's a little hard to draw across this big table where you can see it, so I'm winging it a little bit. Underneath the armpit is not an area people are going to see in a lot of detail, and I am an upcycler, enjoying the freedom of not being in fashion design school. Woohoo! I do like to mark if I'm using a 1/2 inch, or if I'm using 5/8, or if I'm using a 1/4, because I do tend to use different seam lines in different places. As an upcycler, my go-to is a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch. The 1/2 inch because it's very easy to see, the 1/4 inch because that's about how wide most of my presser feet are, so it's very easy to line up to, and it preserves more of the fabric. Again, we're going to cut this out. When I do this just as a top, I think I'll make it a little longer. I've noticed that I actually want my crops to go a few inches past my waistline. And we're cutting it at the back height. We're going to keep our side seams intact when we use the leggings, so we're not going to create a new side seam. So I actually didn't need the seam allowance there, and I am lining up based on where those seam lines overlap. Here, I'll flip it back. Yeah, I can see that I'm basically lining up so that these are where the seam line would happen. I could cut the seam allowance off, but that's just extra work. Okay, now these are both at neckline height for the back, and one of them is going to have to become the front. I actually got a little confused here when I was putting this together. I started marking it in all kinds of crazy places. What's important is that one is the back and one is the front. The one that's going to be the back, you keep the neckline that you have. The one that's going to be the front, you're going to use that lower neckline. And that neckline is not the same shape as our pattern. And what's important here is that your neckline lands right up in that corner so that your shoulder seams are the same width as each other. All right, it's time to take our garment apart. So I'm going to just start slowly so you get a sense of the actual time that I'm taking to carefully cut right down the middle of the seams. And now that you know that, I can just kind of hurry it up, but you can see that we cut right down the middle there, right in the middle, so that we're preserving as much fabric as possible. Sometimes it's worth it to do a seam rip, but it really depends on the fabric and the situation. In this case, totally not worth it. Lots of fabric, totally not worth it. Now we're going to lay our pieces out. We're going to see where they can land in such a way that we can get the most for them. And that front neckline is going to go straight down and across into a V. So the center front is actually surpassed by the two layers of fabric that are going to cross each other. And now I'm just looking to see where that sleeve can be. And this is where the bottom of the sleeve is determined by the fabric and not the pattern. I'm preserving as much as I can on the right because I know that we need more fabric for the back. And I'm going to use whatever's left from that cutout to extend the back piece. You know, as I look at what I'm doing here, I think I could have actually zero-waisted the sleeves a little better. Instead of taking them in at the bottom, they could have gone straight down just using everything that was left of the leggings. So we can move our sleeve aside. Yay, we have our sleeves. Now on the back, if you look here, you can see that we don't have enough fabric. So we're going to take what's left from our little sleeve project, and I'm going to cut two straight lines because they're just easier to piece together than curvy lines. I want this to be easy for you. And so we're going to make the line that is in the existing back of the pattern. We're going to make that straight, and we're also going to make a straight line on the largest of the cutout pieces so that we can sew these two pieces together. And I'm erring on giving more fabric at the top than at the bottom because I know that I'm going to have a cutout in the back, and it's not so important that that cutout come all the way across the waist. The bottom half of the dress is going to be the waistline there, so I will need more fabric to connect at the top. If a dress or a top is low cut in the front and you try and make it low cut in the back too, it will slide off your sleeves. This was one of my first lessons in upcycling. So it's really good for us to actually use the shape of that back neckline. So I want fabric at the top of the back that will go pretty much all the way across. So that's our goal here. And you can see we can only come up so high before we run out of fabric right there. Yeah, oh, there we go. Whoa. And there's still gonna be a few inches of back that aren't covered, and you can see the shape of the cutout on the back is gonna be kind of an arch shape. It's a myth that you need a specific kind of sewing machine to work with knits. The reason I'm working on this vintage machine though is I just want to show you with zigzag and a straight stitch you really can do just about everything you need to. So I tested out a straight stitch because that's my go-to, and it actually looked great on this fabric. I didn't see a lot of stretching or rippling. If you pull the fabric as you go through the machine, it tends to stretch it out and you get kind of a lettuce leaf thing. In this case, we don't want that. I did a couple of test stitches, and to my great joy, this is a thick, heavyweight lycra, and it does not stretch out and become super wavy, so that's great. And I looked at the zigzag, which is not as clean of a stitch as a straight stitch, and I decided that I'm going to go with a straight stitch on this. The logic is that 90% of my seams are going up and down the long end of the body. They're not going to need to do a lot of stretching, and this fabric is very stretchy, so I'm not so worried about busting seams. All right, we're piecing this back piece onto the back, and at the beginning I want to go forward a few stitches and back tack so that that's locked in. It's the overlapping stitch that creates the knot. The other thing I want to show you here is that I am slightly pushing the fabric towards the presser foot, not enough that we get actual puckers in it, but I don't want the presser foot to be doing any pulling. I've learned that even if I just hold it flat, sometimes I get wavy lines in the back, and I hate that. I'm sure you'll hate it too. And of course, we take our pins out before we go over them. One thing that's happening here is because I cut that seam allowance, there's little pieces of it left, and they're going to push my fabric off to the left, and I'm compensating by really pushing the fabric off to the right. This is why you see me lifting up the presser foot, you see me pushing the fabric to the right, you see that I'm having to re-angle it to get it to lay flat. So I'm really struggling against gravity here. Gravity wants to push that bulky fabric off to one side or the other. All right. And I'm very careful to line up both layers of fabric with each other. You can see that. I'm using my fingers to keep them lined up and with the side of the presser foot. So, and if it starts to go one direction, I pull it back. I'm using my fingers like pins here. And again, just making sure that there isn't any extra work for the sewing machine to pull that fabric through under the needle. I'm being fairly careful with my sewing, and you can see the difference between how puckered a pin makes it versus your fingers for lining things up. And I'm avoiding the very end of this section we're piecing in because it has some elastic in it, and I don't want that rumpled part to affect our seam. And I'll do a back tack here at the end, locking that seam down. Okay, so that is one of the back pieces where we've extended the fabric, and then I'm going to do the same thing again. This time I don't feel like you really need to see all the details. We're just going to make it happen kind of quickly for you here. Again, look how much the pins pucker before I pull them out. This is why fingers are so much more handy, and I oftentimes don't use very many pins when I'm sewing. And again, really forcing the fabric to stay in place as we go under the presser foot. All right, we have our back pieces pieced together. And this is what we have, two pieces of source fabric now that look approximately the same. And when we lay them on top of each other, we'll be able to cut the front and back pieces together. We can get every little bit of our pattern onto this chunk of fabric. When I have those corners exactly where I want them, Yeah, right in there. And I'm checking to make sure that I haven't lost that bottom layer. It's very easy when the hidden layer underneath can be too short or moved out of the way. So it's really important to kind of check those. Yeah, right in there. And then I'm just using some fabric weights / rocks from my garden that I decoupaged to hold things in place. Cans of soup work well if you're new to sewing. You may not want to invest the time into decoupaging your rocks. And I'm just trimming up that tiny bit of fabric that was sticking off there. And I'm going to go a little in fast motion here. I'm not cutting in real time. This is not as precision of cutting as the releasing of the inseams. And you can see I'm cutting both layers at the same time. And I'm not cutting off that front extension. It's really pretty much all that fabric we're going to want for the crossover, so we're just keeping it. From here, we're going to sew our shoulder seams. I pin the corners in place, and I put that fabric as super accurately as I can. Get over there. Super accurate. And then I pin it down. We're going to take these to the sewing machine and sew a few seams. And again, there's always back tack. One thing to be careful of here is we did that back extension, so I would flatten that seam out just so you have a distribution of the bulk from it. When things get bulky, they're a little harder to sew, and just flatten it out underneath. You can pin it, you can baste it, you could glue it. Lycra does not tend to take glue stick as well as cotton, so I'm just using my fingers here to make sure that it's flat. And you'll notice that the top overlaps a little bit with the bottom. That's because I didn't true any of my seam allowances, but we're basically going to want the end of the seam to land exactly where those two pieces of fabric kind of connect. Okay. And I sewed both of these seams. One thing you can see is that when I lay the shoulder flat, you can kind of see that this sticks out a little bit. It's not a nice even line from front to back. It's got kind of a little bulge there. So I'm going to kind of blend that out. I'm not actually going to cut it off. I'm just giving myself a guide because I don't want to have to redo that seam and put a new knot in the end. So I want to preserve the knot so it doesn't come apart, but mark a more even kind of smoother connection. And your pattern may or may not need this. It's just something to check and be aware of, because across the shoulder, this is our decorative area, so we want that to look nice and tidy when we get it sewn down. All right, we're going to hem our neckline. So I'm just going to fold this over 1/4 inch. Whee! Okay, and I like to put most of my pins in. That first one doesn't matter because the needle's going to be there. I like to imagine that I'm at the sewing machine and the bulk of the fabric is on my left and the throat of the sewing machine is on my right, so that when I come towards those pins, I can easily grab the little heads. Sometimes I pin side to side, sometimes I pin perpendicular. In this case, it's like a narrow seam, and perpendicular I find much more helpful for that because you can pin in 2 places at once rather than 1. So what we're doing here is the beginning of a double fold hem, and again we're reaching to the seam allowance. We're going to take some of that bulk out by folding it over. And this is the first step of the double fold hem. If I was doing this on cotton, I would be pressing this instead of sewing it. But the Lycra does not hold a press nearly as well, so I'm just going to pin it and skip the pressing. So if you're wondering why I'm using pins to prepare this, that's why. I put my needle in to hold things in place before I take the pin out and lower the presser foot. I grab a hold of both of those threads in the back so that I can use them to sort of start edging the stitch forward. I'm not bothering with the back tack here because, as I mentioned before, this is really just a temporary thing to hold this in place. It's also going to make a nice guide for where we want to sew the second stitch of the double fold hem when we hem it down. Okay, so now that we're going, I showed you in real time about how fast we're going. Now we're just going to speed through this because there's really nothing noteworthy going on here. So, boom. Oh, wait, let's slow down because here we have the area where we're going to go over that shoulder seam. And this is where sometimes problems tend to happen. So one thing we could do to get over that shoulder seam is if the machine is slowing down at all, we could put a little wedge under there. But for right now, I'm just going to sort of tug on the back. And I know I don't usually like to tug on things, but this is a little thick area. And there the fabric was sort of unfolding because of all that bulk there, so I had to realign it. And if you have to lift up the presser foot to get underneath to realign things, that's entirely fair. And that's just one of the things that you learn as you build confidence in sewing, is just how to manipulate and maneuver the fabric as it goes under that needle so that it stays lined up. What's more important to line up here is with the right side of the fold, and your presser foot lining up evenly is more important than getting the fold the exact perfect distance. I am looking at both sides. I'm looking at the left side going under the left side of the presser foot in the same place, but the one that I'm looking at more closely at this point is the one on the right side, and it is about 1/8 inch underneath the presser foot. Okay. And I'm just checking the stitch to see if I like it. There's a little bit of waviness here, but it's really, really not bad. I've seen things that look just disastrous. So we're just going to set up and do the second fold in exactly the same place. This fold will be a little easy because the thickness of the fabric is kind of determining where it needs to land. And even more than the last time, it's super important to line up against the edge of the presser foot because your stitching is going to show. So if it's not even, it's all going to show on the other side when you get done. So this one, you want to be really careful that your right sides line up beautifully. And again, I'm slowing down to show you the tricky little section here at the shoulder seam. And I sometimes sew a little slower here. And I also keep an ear out for the machine making any scary, nasty noises, like it just did. Okay, that was the sound of, yeah, a little knot happening. And so I'm just going to dig it out after one stitch, and we're going to do a little bit of cleanup. Normally, I really am loath to do this on the outside of a fabric, but I think as opposed to taking the whole thing out and letting it over, I'm going to do a mend. So you can see the little knot where the thread's jammed up, and I'm just going to kind of clean that off. We're not going to sit here and spend 10 minutes watching me take this out, which is about how long it takes. I'll just clip one thread so you can see basically what I'm doing is very carefully clipping threads and not clipping the fabric. When you have a little area where you had to take it out because there was a problem with sewing, you can do a mend. And to do this, you're going to put your needle in the stitch line about 1 inch before the area that needs to be repaired. And this is so you get overlapping stitches. So it's like doing a back tack. This creates a knot because there are 2 layers of stitching and it won't come out. You sew across the area you're fixing and then just sew 1 inch past that. All right, so that is our double fold hem all along the front around to the center back. While I'm in hemming mode, I'm changing up the plan here. I'm going to hem the back cutouts at the same time, and it's exactly the same way. Well, you're going to go from here to here, so I am going to show you the pinning. So here at this thick part where there's already a seam, I'm putting the pin in before and after that seam so that I don't have to go through the thickness of that. It's kind of hard to do that. And this part curves a little. That's also going to make it a little hard to get through. So I'm pinning it down just to help hold that in place. I'm also going to cut out the bulk of this, and I just want you to see that once I've cut out just that little seam area, so when I do that first seam, there won't be any fabric folding over. But when I do that second fold over, this is all going to tuck under, and you won't see that raw edge anymore, so it's going to just look fine. And not having that bulk cuts down on the likelihood of having any kind of bobbin jam ups and just makes for a smoother ride. So now we're going to sew the two back pieces together. You can see the seams are all in place. I'm sorry that I didn't take you to the machine again, but it's so the same thing that we've already done twice. All right, so I always like to check after I pin something to make sure that it's right before I go to the machine. And it's always right sides together, right? So we have our right sides together. Again, I'm going to put my needle in to hold things together, and then I can take my pin out. So once that needle's holding things in, I can get the pin out of the way. It kind of drives me crazy when beginners start sewing before they put their needle down into their fabric. So it's really, this is your moment to have precision. Now what I'm doing here with this folded up piece of paper underneath the back of the machine is because of those hemlines, the fabric is fairly thick at the beginning. So the machine is automatically going to start to jam up because it has trouble going forward because it's going uphill. But if I put the back half of that presser foot up onto something so that it's going downhill, and again, I'm hitting a little folded up hemline area. If I go downhill, then it sews right over it and we don't have the same jam ups. It's such a nice little trick. So you see me doing this all the time, just putting anything under there. I've seen people use buttons. I've seen them use, there's something called a hump jumper. I've seen them get devices, but the main idea here is don't sew uphill. Sewing uphill makes for bad, bobbin jam ups. Basically, it's hard to go forward. And you can see I'm off by about 1/16 of an inch. The two different ends of the hem are slightly off from a distance. No one's going to notice. It looks pretty good. So I'm happy enough with this. I would not get an A on it if I was back in fashion design school, but as an upcycler, I think this is great. My little cuts are kind of hard to see, so I'm just marking all of my areas for the gathers with pins so that I can see them a little bit more easily and not miss them. It's very easy to, with this concrete pattern, to not be able to see things like the little cuts and stuff like that. So just because it's hard to see, and I'm also going to be sewing from the white side of the fabric, that'll make it easier for me to see too. I am not leaving my marking at the top of this because I noticed that for whatever reason, I happen to line up perfectly with a seam, so they're both already have a seam marking the center of the cap. So I'm leaving that out. And we're going to sew between the two notches. And these notches and little markings and guides on the pattern are really important to transfer before we sew because we use them to line things up. Now I'm going to a basting stitch. I'm turning the tension all the way down. And this time you're not going to put a knot in. All we're doing here is sewing very close to the edge of the fabric. So if our seam allowance is going to be 1/2 inch, we might go 1/4. If our seam allowance is going to be 1/4 inch, we might go 1/8 from the edge of the fabric. We want a little line of stitching that's going to go in the seam allowance all the way between those two notches across the top of the cap. And we're going to use this thread to do gathers. So we want it very loose on one side. So that's why we turn the tension all the way down to just barely above 0. And I'm going to stop at that pin, taking it out, but I'm not doing a back tack here. Very important. You cannot pull your threads, which is the whole point of these threads is to be able to pull them and do a gather. You can't do that if you put a knot in. So don't put a knot in. And I'm just doing it on both sides. So this one I'm going to kind of zip through a little quickly. You just saw me do it. It's exactly the same thing from one notch all the way around to the other. I can't make that sound. Well, the machine's making it for me in fast motion. I do like my sound effects. It's true. Alrighty, so this I think is kind of the fun part because you start to see the gathered part take shape. So I'm going to pull from the side that the bobbin was on. The loose thread is the top thread, so the tight thread is the bottom thread, and that was the outside of the fabric. So what I'm doing is I'm holding the thread and sliding the fabric along the thread. So it looks like I'm pulling the thread, but I'm actually pulling the fabric along the thread. And I can see, oh, the top of my sleeve's gathered. Oh, it looks so cute. I'm kind of loving that part. All right, let's do both sides. Gather, 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 gather. I'm not getting it exact at this point because when I pin it into place, I'm going to have some guides and that'll help me put it exactly where I need it to be. Next step, let's sew those underseams. So here is a place for precision. It's very nice to have the end of your sleeves line up. The armpit, I'm being precise, but it's not nearly as important. Very few people are going to see your armpit, but you know, it's a good place to practice. And these two seams, I'm going to make them line up. Now, one thing I'm noticing is there's a little extra fabric from the layers, so we might have a little bit of extra bulk on the inside when we sew the seam because there's 4 layers of fabric we're going through. All right, let's take it to the sewing machine. Oh, where's a shim when I need one? Got that needle in. I can take the pin out now. Now I'm going to chase down the shim first. There's my shim. All right, goodbye pin. And here we go. And this is a very thick part, so I want to be kind of generous with my back tack because it would be easy for the threads to get pushed apart by all that extra fabric. Now I'm going to slightly pull here so that that top layer of fabric sort of smooths out. When I get close to that pin where the seams are lined up, I'm going to stop and I'm going to do hand crank turns. I should have gotten a shot of the hand crank. Sorry, next time. I'm still learning the best way to share this information with you, but that was forward ever on the hand crank, backward never. Okay, and we got right to where that pin was holding that seam exactly in place. We're going over a little bulky area, so I'm shimming again. And you'll just see me do it a lot because I found over the years, I just found shimming really, really useful. The other thing you'll see me do a lot is stick a little piece of paper under the end. If I have stretchy fabric or thin fabric, a little piece of paper stabilizes it so that it doesn't get jammed into the machine at the end. And in this case, usually I leave my needle in and stop a few stitches ahead of time, but I got right to the edge, so I'm kind of shoving it under with the thread that's under there, and I'm going to go back and forward, and I just rip this little piece of paper off afterwards so that it's not in there anymore. It's not a big deal. Usually it's perforated by the needle and it just pops right off. It's a very good habit to cut all of your extra threads off right away. I think I managed to do it 80% of the time. And this is just me showing you the other sleeve so that you have symmetry. Same thing, just faster. So here I am going fast motion because this is a much tidier version of me putting that paper under at the end. Okay, so now this is what our sleeves look like. Let's match them up to the shoulder. So we're going to take the high point of that collar, that little seam area, and we're going to put the right sides together. And I just like to double check, is that the right side? Is that the right side? Yes, it is. And we're going to pin that in place. So now I know that I have my right sides together. The sleeve is really worth double or triple checking to make sure your right sides were facing each other. Because I like to then go inside to do all my pinning. So we did the top mark. So we lined up the top. Now we're lining up the bottom. I'm going right through the middle of that seam at the seam line. So our new seam line is going to be, I think I'm doing this at 5/8. I don't know. Can't remember. All that matters is I do it the same on both sides. I think it was the 1/2 inch that I had on my finger. Okay, so we get that lined up. I like to use gravity. I really don't want either of these layers. I want them to lay as smoothly as possible next to each other. So I am pinning in the air, but I'm kind of using gravity to kind of make sure that, oh, can you line up? I give my fabric a little shake, and then it kind of lines itself up, and I just slide the edges together. And the first little part of this is going to be really easy because it's going to want to line up. But what's going to happen as we get up to the curvy part where that little mark is and the gathers begin is the outside is bigger than the inside because it was on a circle, right? And the outside of a circle is bigger than the inside of a circle. So we're going to get to a point here where it starts to sort of look like it's buckling up at the edge, but the part that is even is exactly where we're going to be sewing our seams. So you can see some little extra bits of fabric on the top layer here, but where I'm putting the needle in at that 1/2 inch point, that is nice and flat. Now we're at the gather part. And this is fun because we don't have to worry as much about puckers. We're trying to make puckers. So I take a few minutes to sort of gather up more fabric if I need it and stretch this out and even it up as much as I can. And then I lay the edges down next to each other and we're going to pin them in place. Now the sleeve, arm's eye area is somewhere that I do tend to use a lot of pins. This is something that's just a little trickier to sew. To our advantage, one thing that hides a lot of flaws is gathers. Okay, now we're doing the other direction. So I'm coming back to that underarm where the fabric's going to lay pretty nicely next to each other, pretty flat. If I just let gravity do its thing, yeah, give the little fabric a little shake. And I'm holding, you can see my finger at the 1/2 inch mark, not the edge. It's really the 1/2 inch down that I'm worrying about lining up. So I'm looking at the edges to line up, but I'm holding it 1/2 inch down, and that's where that pin is going in, is where I'm going to sew. That's where it's important to hold it together. And once again, we're starting to get up into the area where that circle goes around, and we're going to see that the outside edge is not necessarily going to line up as much as that area that's 1/2 inch in. But back to what I was saying about knit is very forgiving because if it's not lining up perfectly, you can kind of stretch the knit to make it work. And also when you're sewing woven garments and you're putting in arm size, there's a bias and it's a curvy area, and that also helps a little bit with sort of fudging where it doesn't line up perfectly. So I found that you may, as a sort of novice sewer, not care if your gathers go all in the same direction, if they're going higgledy-piggledy, but I've found that it really looks nicer if you just take a few minutes to sort of line these gathers up so they're all about the same size and pointed in the same direction, so they're pointed perpendicular to the seam. And you'll see more of me futzing with that and fudging that when I actually sew that seam together, and you'll see how you can manipulate the fabric there. All right, we're going to sew all the way around the outside edge of the sleeve. I start in the armpit. The areas that bobbin jams tend to happen are at seam crossings and at beginnings and ends of things. So I like to start and end in the most hidden area, which is the armpit. So we're going to put that needle in. It's holding everything together. I'm sewing this at 5/8. I know I only made myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but here I am sewing it at 5/8. That's just how I roll sometimes. And in this case, when I'm going all the way around a circle, I don't usually do a back tack because I can overlap the threads when I come all the way back around, and it's the overlapping threads that create the knot. That's why we do these back tacks. I know we have pins in, but pins are only part of the lining up story. All the time, especially on a tricky seam like this, we're going to need to do our own lining up. So you're going to see, and this I'm doing really all in real time because there's so much to learn here. So another thing that we want to be careful about is puckers on the bottom. If you can see, I'm constantly kind of looking at the bottom of my fabric there every time I stop, and I stop whenever things start to pile up. It's very easy to get a pucker underneath, and that we don't want. We want that shoulder area, the bodice part, we want that to lay smooth. We want all our puckers to be up in the gathered area of the sleeve. Okay, and here I am really working, I'm kind of stretching the fabric at the edge so that that area is lining up more flat. And I'm pushing that fabric underneath into a flatter shape because it's starting to drag this way just by the way it pushes against the sewing machine. You can see on the bottom the sewing machine is pulling against the fabric. Oh, and I don't have I don't have a sewing table. This machine is so old, almost 100 years old. I looked on the internet and it was built in the 1930s. So it doesn't have replacement parts. I could maybe try and engineer a sewing table, but I just don't miss it that much. Okay, so here we are going into a corner. We're just about at where the gathers start, which is a very exciting part. So here you see me lining up those gathers. So I'm holding that one down that was sort of, it was a bigger gather than the others. And I'm kind of pushing it in place. And now I'm also lining up the edges. So all those gathers seem to end at the same point and creating a seam allowance that creates them. See how underneath it's folding? And I just pulled it flat, okay? And it may not look that straight here, but as it's going under the presser foot, that's the area where I'm keeping it really, really straight and really flat and really lined up. Sometimes I like to use, you know, my fingers get very close to the needle here, so it's important to go slow. Sometimes I use a pin in there to help push those gathers in place or to secure things. And every, I don't know, maybe quarter inch or so, every half inch or so, I'm going to look underneath and see what my layers are doing underneath, because I know that it's really easy to get a pucker in that shoulder area without noticing. Okay, so let's see what's going on underneath. Am I going to look? Oh, here I am bragging about how I look underneath. No, I'm not going to look. Oh, Stacy, you're failing me. And you can see that the seam line we're putting down now is a good 3/8 of an inch farther away from the edge than our gathers are. So that seam we used to gather things, here I am using a pin to put gathers in. That seam is never going to show the one that we used to create our gathers. Oh, see, there's a big pucker there at the very end. It's common for the thread, it's loose at the end, it's common for those puckers to kind of fall apart. So I'm evening them out, spending a minute decorating them, holding it all down with my finger and the needle, and then we're going to just sew forward. Once we get to that other gathered needle, I'm home free. And just so you know, that big long guideline on this vintage machine, that's the 5/8 mark. I think I'm sewing this at 5/8 instead of half an inch because the 5/8 is so easy to see, and I thought it would show up better for you. Pushing that bottom flat, oh, just get out of the way, thread. Go, move. All right, we are looking good here. I'm very excited. Go away, thread. Now we're at the flat area. Yay, man. The puckers are exciting because they're cute. And you can see that just that pin holding things down is sort of creating a pucker underneath. The puckers are, the gathers are fun because they're cute, but this area is nice because it's kind of a relief after that really tricky section to just be, you know, sewing things flat. And I use my fingers to feel through to that other layer too, so as well as looking underneath, I'm doing it by braille as well. Just making sure that we don't have folds on the other side of the fabric. That's the tricky thing here. If you do get a fold, it's okay to take a few stitches out and then just sew back over that area. If you overlap before and after, the area that you repair that overlapping of the thread, that'll create a knot, so it's okay to do that. The other thing that's okay is if you're finding that your sleeves aren't lining up exactly right here with a stretch knit, you can just put a little bit of a stretch, just a little bit of a stretch to make whichever one is too short longer. It's going to have a gathering effect, not a complete fold like we did on the top, but it'll have a slight gathering effect wherever you do that. So try to avoid doing it in weird places. If you have to take out extra fabric, the cap of the sleeve is sort of the best place to do it. And there we are, overlapping with our original stitch, making a knot, and then I just felt like doubling down on it. So I did, but that is not 100% necessary. All right, let's have a look at that. I always like to check my work before I go on. And you can see from the inside of the garment what it looks like. And here it is. Oh, so pretty. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm getting happy now. And you can see that we did a pretty good job lining our seams up. Everything's lining up really nicely there. I'm kind of impressed with myself. I know you think I should be a professional, but I'm kind of impressed with myself anyway. Okay, and then that other sleeve is pinned in. It's ready to be sewn. Now we've got our sleeves on, we've got our whole little, it's all built. I expect you don't have a dress form, so I really recommend putting this on yourself. Mia is a very different size than me, so I'm using my dress form, and you're just going to figure out how far down you want it to cross over so that it looks good going across the bust line. Come over to your cutting table or your flat area. You don't have a cutting table, you're a beginning sewer, right? And just smooth all this out. Yeah, we're just gonna remove and repin that so it's smooth. And we're gonna pin those bottom layers together, not the back, just those front layers where it crosses over, so that they're already taken care of when we add it to the waistband. I'm also, this is kind of optional, I'm also going to put a seam all along here because I hate when things gape, and I'm really just going to top stitch right along where that hem stitch is already, so it doesn't look like a new stitch, it looks like the same stitch repeated. Now it's time to put the pieces together. We have the big pieces built. So I'm going to find the center front. I'm basically folding things in half and just putting a pin to mark the center front and marking the center back too for easy reference. We're going to bring our top into the game, and to find the center front, we're going to hold the two back ends together and let gravity do the work. Yeah, it found it. And it's right there. I'm just going to put a pin to mark it. And I'm going to keep an eye on that pin. You might use a different colored pin or something like that. I'm going to keep an eye on that pin so I know which one is going to match up with center front on the skirt. And again, we're going to put right sides together. That's always the way. It's really worth double checking after you pin things to look at what that seam is going to look like before you actually sew it down. So right sides together, and I'm just, now that I've got those matched up, I'm moving that pin out of place. And I'm going to pin outward from the center to both sides. And again, I'm trying really hard not to pull on either layer of fabric, but let them hold their natural shape. The more they hold their natural shape, the less puckering I'm likely to get. And pinning it down about an inch from center back. All right, now we're going the other way and doing the exact same thing. I can use the pins that were holding the layers together, so I don't have too many extra pins in there. Every pin I have to slow down for adds sewing time, so I like to use the minimum number of pins that I feel I need. You can also use clips, like we're working with a thicker skirt here, so clips would be another option. I just have pins handy. I'm having a pin kind of day. All right, all the way around. And here I've pinned perpendicularly, and I'm just again going to check and make sure that the right sides are together. If I sew that together, is it going to have all of the right sides out? And it does look like it will, so that's great. This is always sew. We're going to go all the way around, and we're going around the waist, and we're going through 2 thick layers of fabric. So I'm going to switch to a zigzag stitch for the first time here. A zigzag stitch, when that fabric gets pulled on, sort of straightens out, and it can hold 2 layers together very nicely and allow for stretch. At the very beginning of the stitch, I actually like to do my knot with a straight stitch. So you saw me go to straight stitch for a moment and do my back tack. And now I am sewing along here. And I'm going to tell you, this is where I ran into a little bit of trouble for the first real time on this project. And it's because, if you can see what I'm doing, is I'm slightly pulling things along. Now, back in some vintage sewing machine manuals, this is how they told you back in the day to sew knit stitches together. They did not have Lycra, they did not have super stretchy knits. They had knits that were a lot more solid. Okay, and I'm coming to a seam. So what am I going to do? I'm going to leave the needle in. I'm going to shove that thing down. I'm going to hop up on the presser foot and jump over it. Okay, and then if I have to, I'll push a little or I'll pull a little to get over that bumpy part. But what I did here is just slightly pulled. You can see that when I let go of the fabric, it condenses. So that slight pull created enormous waves, and it's really that I'm working with 2 different kinds of stretch. So the skirt is a gathered elastic stitch, and the actual fabric it's made from is a woven fabric, and the Lycra and this gathered woven fabric have extremely different amounts of stretch to them. So I got all done with this little seam. I put my little knot in at either end. So we're sewing in a circle, but we're not sewing all the way around because those backs have a cutout on them because we didn't have enough fabric. So there's a cutout there. So we are doing a back tack at the beginning and end. And now you can see that I'm not happy. There's a wrinkle to the way those connect together. Look at that. So if it's hanging loose, if it's not really tight on Mia, it's going to look horrible. I hate it. Now, what did I do? I took it apart. I did it again, and then I did it again. And it took me 3 times and several test stitches to find something that would work. And what I wound up doing was sewing the gathered skirt on top of, rather than a seam that folded over, but sewing it directly on top of the Lycra. So this is me measuring where the top of the Lycra is going to go for it to overlap and get stitched down. I'm not worrying about finishing the edges on Lycra. It doesn't tend to unravel. This sort of myth of knits unraveling comes from a day when things were hand knit, and they did unravel. But ever since double knit, we haven't really had that issue so much. What we have more with unfinished edges is issues of curling, issues of it can get ratty much easier. It doesn't look good, as an unfinished seam often. Sometimes it curls. Okay. I'm going to double check the 2 sides against each other. This one looks like it's a little longer, and I really want them to end at the same height because when you're looking at the back of the dress, you're going to see those 2 sides next to each other. So I'm just going to check and make sure that those 2 distances from really it's that upper seam that you can see, the upper seam, that's going to be visible, and we want that distance down to where our waistband is going to be. We want that to be even. So I'm not checking it against the bottom, which will be hidden. I'm checking it to make sure it's equal amounts down and that we land in the same place in relationship to the lines that we will see. Okay. So now I have my center front marked again, both on the skirt and on the top. And instead of putting right sides together, I'm going to lay one on top of the other right side. And I'm going to mark all on here. And what this will be is similar to when we put the top crossover layer together with a top stitch. It's going to be similar to that. And I'm putting it high enough to cover those marks, just barely. So some of those marks might get lost in the seam line. With that particular design, I really can't imagine anyone ever noticing my marks. But maybe if Mia watches this whole how to make your dress thing, maybe she will notice them. And you can see in this case I am using quite a few pins. I'm not confident that fabric won't move around, and I'm trying very hard to get the two layers to lay flat against each other before I pin it. Oh, lay flat, lay flat. When top stitching in, boy, look at how that bottom skirt, it just wants to stretch out. Okay, don't stretch out. Baby, don't stretch out. Behave. Come on, girl. Yes, there we go. And as usual, I started at the center and I worked my way out. And now I'm going to go to the other side and do the same thing. I did not videotape me zigzagging this all the way down, but as you'll see in a minute here, it worked decently. I'm not going to say it worked perfectly, but it worked decently. It was a completely respectable garment. And I just did the zigzag stitch as a top stitch all the way along here. And just a reminder of what these things looked like before. Here's how much fabric was left. And here's what the finished dress looked like. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha Sharanam Ganesha. 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 Ganapati, Ganapati, Ganapataye, Ganapataye. If you ran into any troubles along the way, I have some great news for you. I'm going to do a live feed where I basically make the top half of this in my size, and you can ask me questions in the chat window along the way so we can delve into anything that wasn't clear in this video in more detail. Please drop a comment ahead of time if you'd like me to address it when I do get there. And thank you so much for upcycling and doing your part to kick the fast fashion habit.